Hey YouTube, you're going to love this interview. By the end of it, you're going to know a lot about neurofeedback, the latest advancements in neurotech, and you'll walk away with insights you can use if you're interested in getting into the cool new fields of neurotech and neurofeedback. Also, I wanted to let you know I'm new to podcasting, and there's a setting in Zoom I didn't know about that would show both Cody and me at the same time during the interview. So in this video, you'll just be seeing my guest, Dr. Cody Rall, and you'll be hearing me when I ask the questions. But just know that I'm enjoying the interview with you and hosting it for you. Thank you and enjoy. Welcome to the BrainPal podcast. This is your host, Devin Rome. And today I'm here with Dr. Cody Rall, MD. He's a medical psychiatrist at the U.S. Navy. And he also runs Tech for Psych, where he talks about and applies his medical knowledge to neurotechnology and the latest advancements in wearable tech for your noggin. And he talks about how you can apply it to your real life. One thing I've always appreciated and really liked about Dr. Rall is that he brings his discipline as a medical doctor and also a clinician to the topic of neurotech. So I think that makes him uniquely qualified and also authoritative on the topic. So I'm really excited to talk about the latest advancements in neurotech and also his opinions and feelings about the topic and any other medical opinions that he'll have today. Dr. Rall, ready to get started?
Yeah, thanks, Devin. I appreciate the intro. It's nice to be here on BrainPal, and hopefully I can give you some good information for your noggin.
All right, I'm excited. So the first question I have for you, and I talk about this with a lot of the people that I have on the podcast, I talk about their background and how they got into what they're doing now. So my first question is, why psychiatry?
Yeah, so when I went into medical school, I considered all the different options. I had actually shadowed a general surgeon before I went to medical school, so that was definitely an option for me. But as I got further into training, I realized that I didn't really wasn't really excited about general anatomy after I learned the uh, the organ systems and decided I didn't really want to just do gallbladder surgeries for the rest of my life. My hat's off to them; they do great work, but I was much more interested in bigger questions. And so for a while there, I was between neurology and psychiatry, and I just found that psychiatrists had much more of an impressive vocabulary concerning behavior and how the mind can affect not only mental health, but also the health of the body. So I never thought that I would be a psychiatrist, but that was the direction that I ended up going. And as I got into it further, I got even more curious about brain imaging and neuroscience. So that's really what led me down this path eventually.
I see. So it sounds like you had an interest in medicine going into medical school, but you weren't 100% set on, oh, I'm going to be a psychiatrist and work with imaging.
Yeah, I have always enjoyed physics and engineering and
Mm,
technology. And I think that that really played a role as I went through my medical training. I noticed that I sort of craved engineering a little bit. And, um, although medicine works very closely with technology, it's not always so, especially if you're doing more of a therapy route with psychiatry, so doing psychodynamic therapy, that type of thing. It's definitely changing. There's a lot of digital tools that providers can use with their patients now. But again, I was really interested in how can we actually look at the brain as an organ and start quantifying different things that were unquantifiable before, things like attention, your ability to change tasks, your ability to relax, your ability to meditate. These are all things that I think have been very ephemeral in the past. But now that we have tools to gather data, I think that we can become even more powerful as a people in understanding ourselves and being able to harness that power to help with our productivity, but also balance our way of living.
I see. Very interesting. So that segues into my next question pretty well. So you got interested in neuroimaging and you learned relatively in the middle of your psychiatry training, oh yeah, this neuroimaging stuff seems pretty cool. Now, how did you get into the this relatively new field of neurofeedback? Did you learn about that in medicine, or was this after you graduated and you're like, oh, these wearable things are cool? Or how did you start that neurofeedback?
Yeah, good question. I guess I'll back up a little bit. When I was first considering psychiatry, I did a rotation at Walter Reed, which is the flagship hospital for Army medicine. I was in the Navy, but there's a dual program, Navy and Army, at that facility.
Yes.
And they had some of the most advanced brain imaging technology in the world there. They had the National Intrepid Center of Excellence. which was a project by a man named Fisher, who donated a lot of money to help veterans, especially during that time that were coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. And if you recall, in that conflict, we had a lot of IED blasts happening, and people were being exposed to those blasts and coming back with a lot of symptoms that weren't very well defined.
Yes.
Even if they didn't have a penetrating head injury, God forbid, like a bullet to the head or anything like that, they would come back and they'd have anxiety, they'd have irritability, mood issues, sleep problems. And a lot of that work was separating it out from PTSD, but often there would be symptoms to include tinnitus and instability in gait, that type of thing, that would suggest neuronal injury, actual damage to the neuronal tissue of the brain. And one of the things that floored me was that you would have patients that would do normal imaging and they wouldn't find anything, but then they would use a different type of machine, a diffusion weighted MRI machine that actually can see the white matter tracks of the myelin tissue in the brain, and actually see that there was microscopic shear forces from blasts that had damaged the neuronal tissue on a microscopic level that was manifesting in these symptoms that we normally would classify as mental health symptoms instead of neurological symptoms. And that just totally blew me away and really opened my mind to the fact that oftentimes in medicine, if we cannot diagnose something, that can be often related to the limit of our technologies to identify the issue at hand so that we can fix it later on. So long story short, I got extremely interested in neuroimaging technologies. Around that time, I actually really enjoyed YouTube, and I wanted to start a YouTube channel. And I was trying different things, talking about evolution, biological evolution, neurotransmitters, anything else that I thought was interesting in the intersect between science, behavior, and biology. And around that time, you had some of the first EEG consumer wearables coming out, like Emotive, Muse, and a few others. NeuroSky was one of them. I put out a video, it did really well, and I'm like, wow, people are really interested in this. And in retrospect, I think what that is that neuroscience has been so off limits to people for so long because of sort of housed away in clinical laboratories. So this is really the first time in history that people at home can get their hands on devices that actually are capable of obtaining data about how their brain functions. So that got me really excited and led me down this path. And so much has happened in the about 8 to 10 years that I've been talking about this on YouTube. Just great companies coming up, gathering data, improving their products. And neurofeedback is an instrumental part of that. I think that when people think about obtaining brain data, they get excited about going through different practices that can help improve their cognitive performance without having to rely on pharmaceuticals. I think another at play here is that meditation became very popular in the last 10 years. I think even now we forget how non-mainstream yoga and meditation were over 10 years ago.
Yes.
And it really has become so integrated into our school of thought that I think neurofeedback has gone along with the ride a little bit.
Yes.
And I'm sure we'll talk about this later in the podcast, but part of that issue in talking about neurofeedback is it better than meditation itself? Because we know meditation has a ton of benefits for people, but when you hook someone up to a device that's recording their brainwaves or other data and giving them sounds or visual feedback about how well they are doing it, and when I say doing it, I'm referring to multiple different modalities, right? There's meditation, there's focus, there's relaxation. Does that actually lead to a measurable effect to warrant buying a device that costs anywhere between $300 to $800, even some of the higher end ones that are in the tens of thousands of dollars?
Yes, I see. So here's a thought based on what you just said. That kind of reminds me of kind of like in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. You were kind of like basically a meathead if you're working out, because the only people that lifted weights regularly were people like Arnold and bodybuilders. And I'd say probably maybe around the 90s, and especially I think a pretty big inflection point in the 2010s when there are a lot of fitness YouTubers and fitness content creators coming out. And then now basically everybody works. So now you're almost weird if you don't weight lift and if you don't run. Same thing with like running marathons. Like I mean, I wasn't alive 40 years ago, but even like when I was a kid, if you ran marathons, it was kind of weird. But now basically everybody runs marathons. It's pretty well documented, the runner's high and stuff like that. So I am pretty optimistic that I think meditation seems to be following a similar trajectory, like you're talking about. And yeah, like you said, neurofeedback might follow a similar trajectory. So that brings up one question that I have in mind. How do you feel when it comes to the medical community and the psychiatric community? What would you say is the current zeitgeist, so to speak, when it comes to neurofeedback in the medical communities?
It's a really good question. There's a lot to dissect there. I think that when you look at health and wellness over the last 20 to 30 years, it is interesting because medicine is all about solving problems, right? You have a patient that comes to you that maybe they've broken a bone. So your orthopedic surgeon will repair that bone. Maybe you have diabetes. There's multiple different ways to treat the diabetes. You can try to diet a little bit better if you catch it early and allow your pancreas to recover so that your insulin levels are adequate to cover your blood sugar levels, or things have gone too far and you need to be prescribed insulin or one of these other pharmaceuticals to control your blood sugar levels. I think that what we've seen with neurofeedback is that if you start early, it has its most benefit. You have to use it as sort of a performance enhancement or a preventative measure to get the most benefit from it, because it is not a quick fix. It's not a magic pill. You have to put a lot of work into it. And I think that it does follow, again, a similar trajectory of where weightlifting and exercise are right now, because I mean, if someone has pretty severe diabetes, they're not going to be able to fix that very well with exercise or diet. So that's where I find the medical community right now is that it is frustrating trying to talk to them about neurofeedback and get that instituted in different preventative measures for medicine. Because when you have someone that comes in with very severe mental health issues, it is hard to say, here's a neurofeedback paradigm, practice every day, and you might get better in about 3 to 6 months. You know,
Yeah.
they want that intervention to be quick. And if you look at how ketamine is taken off within the last couple of years, I think that's a great example of a dramatic intervention that you can do with someone in the very moment and actually have them going from being suicidal to not suicidal. And we know that ketamine and these other psychedelics are really quieting down the self-referential circuits of the brain that have people ruminating all the time and just sort of beating themselves up and worrying to the point at which they feel that daily living is not worth it anymore. So you can do an intervention like ketamine and really help them come out of it. But I think that where neurofeedback and these other meditation technologies come in is that they are what you call ancillary treatments, that you have your sort of surgical intervention like ketamine or some of these other more powerful modalities. But then you also, it's also important for the patient outcome to supplement that with the training, whether that's talk therapy or neurofeedback training, that type of thing.
Yes.
So as far as a dramatic intervention, I would say that neurofeedback isn't there yet. I don't know if it ever will get there. It's kind of like with weightlifting and exercise, you know,
Yes.
if you have someone that has severe diabetes, you give them the insulin, but then also you advocate for them to eat healthy and exercise. So it'll
Yes.
be along the lines of that, I think.
Yes, I see. Now, when it comes to like other psychiatrists, have you ever spoken with any others or read any of the literature when it comes to what the general opinion is?
Yeah. So I think that psychiatrists are more interested in brain imaging and brain data in
Yes.
general.
Mm.
I have, again, been frustrated about, and I'm not, I like neurofeedback, but it's not my entire aim. I
Yes.
want to collect data about the brain and use that to quantify the best interventions to make us not only mentally healthy, but have performance enhancement. And I think that meditation and neurofeedback is an important part of that. But
Yes.
again, we shouldn't limit ourselves to just those practices. Psychiatrists don't know much about neurofeedback.
Yeah.
And I think you asked me this before, but I'll just back up. So the last year of my residency training, there actually was an offer from our program director to go do neurofeedback training from STENS, which is one of the very common training organizations for biofeedback and neurofeedback. And I jumped on the opportunity. I learned so much, and I was floored again by the possibilities that neurofeedback would offer. But then, over the years, I've learned more, and I've learned basically that we have a ton to learn. There are so many different markers going on for the brain that how do you even design a neurofeedback protocol? How do you implement that with clients or a clinical population?
Yes.
And I think that's actually one of the exciting things about the wearables coming to fruition here is that now that they've been out for about 5 to 10 years, we're sort of finally past people asking the question of, do they actually obtain real brain data?
Yeah.
I've felt that tide shift a little bit in the last couple of years. So now that we're past like that, these devices aren't a gimmick and that they're not, collecting any useful data. Now you have to ask the question, does neurofeedback training actually lead to good clinical outcomes? There have been a couple of randomized controlled trials, but they've sort of been exploratory studies for the most part. Muse did one back in 2016 that used a control group that was just doing math exercises versus their neurofeedback training. And they used a couple of measures. They used the Stroop test, which is a good cognitive measure of executive function and reaction time, where you're shown, for instance, the letter green, but it's in red, and you're supposed to differentiate between the two as quick as you can.
Yes.
But again, what's really exciting is that now that these modalities are coming online and a lot of people are using them, we can collect a lot of data. And there's a couple of companies that are actually coming up out of stealth mode right now that have been collecting data. And not only that, but there's quite a few providers around these days that have been practicing neurofeedback for 20, 30 years, almost incognito. No one was inviting them onto podcasts and talking about it, but they were getting great results with their clients. It just wasn't accepted in mainstream. So they've learned a lot over the decades. Now they get to share that knowledge with the rest of the community that's really up and coming right now and incorporate that into software with programs that can collect the data. So I think that's extremely exciting. I think that that hopefully will pan out in some real useful data that can show that neurofeedback has its benefits. But the field is so heterogeneous right now that it's hard to determine the true effects.
Yes.
And this has been common with mental health studies throughout the years as well. I mean, even with antidepressant trials, they had to spend millions and millions of dollars to find the right patients that had the right symptoms that could undergo the medication trial properly and show the results. And we know for a fact that pharmaceutical companies have hidden clinical trials that did not turn out well to show benefits for the medications and only publish the positive results. I definitely think that antidepressants have an effect on the brain. I think that's well established. But as far as useful clinical outcomes, yes, I think they do. But again, the point of telling that story is that the results are very mixed, and it's going to take some time to parse out what protocols are best, how to use those protocols, how to collect the data to show efficacy and get better results for clients and patients. It's going to take some time. I think that there's been exciting initial results, but more work needs to be done.
Yes, I see.
And as far as psychiatrists go, they're in the clinic, managing people that have some serious symptoms. So when you tell them about the prospects of neurofeedback, I think it falls on deaf ears sometimes because they and their patients want the quick fix. So I haven't seen much excitement for neurofeedback at the American Psychiatric Association or, talk amongst psychiatrists. And honestly, that's why I've sort of gone off and done my own thing. I'm a psychiatrist in training, but for instance, I didn't even go to the American Psychiatric Association meeting this year because they're not talking about brain imaging. They're not talking about data analytics for brain data. They're more focused on digital tools and social media platforms to aggregate evidence-based treatments that already exist. And I highly respect what they're doing, but it's just not what I'm into right now. So Right now, it feels like I'm blazing a little bit of my own path, but I definitely have psychiatrist friends that truly believe in this direction that, yourself and I am headed in, and it just hasn't hit the clinical ground floor yet. And that's just the way that medicine goes. There needs to be exploratory work far in advance from when it actually becomes common clinical practice.
Yes, I see, and that makes perfect sense. Thanks for sharing that. Well, here's another question. You brought up like some of the medical studies and how some of the ones that don't show good quote unquote results don't get published. That reminds me, like when I was taking stats classes and like classes on like logic, like logical fallacies, and like learning about stats, and I was like, oh wait, so this study just got published because they had statistical significance, but what about the effect size and the power and all the other things? And well, there are ways to p-hack, as you know, there are ways to manipulate your sample size to get statistical significance. So sometimes there can be a lot of bad science on both the standard medical front and also in the frontiers, so to speak. So one question I have for you is: are you seeing any bad science when it comes to neurofeedback or neurotech right now?
I just feel like they don't have the resources to pour in and get hundreds, if not thousands, of
Yeah.
clients
Mm.
to go into randomized controlled trial. And then, if anything, the bad science, if anything, it's not bad science that I've seen. It's the overinterpretation of the results and not being honest about the limitations of the studies. And maybe I've been guilty of that on YouTube because I'm trying to get people excited about this technology and start using it at home and collecting data and getting involved in these communities that were really, in my opinion, um, sort of groundbreakers in going in this direction. But it is important to communicate the limitations of the technology as well as the studies that have been done so far and be honest about that. And I've been trying to do that better in videos myself. But I'll leave it at that. I don't want to go into any specific examples of companies that have taken it too far.
Yes.
I think that where a lot of companies, or a few at least, and a few big ones, like I think her name was Betsy DeVos, the head of the big neurofeedback company. Is it NeuroOptimal? They had a brick and mortar neurofeedback clinic that really people went after them because of false advertising. We have this neurofeedback that's going to fix your ADHD, and you can't do that. You can't take a medical diagnosis and say that a health and wellness product will fix that problem because it's not FDA approved. So that's where neurofeedback companies have to be careful, is that they need to stick within the health and wellness category for now, because if they talk about it fixing actual allopathic diagnoses, they'll get in trouble. Now, that's changing, right? We have companies like South Korean company iMedisync that has a full-on EEG wearable helmet that has gotten Korean FDA approval and is, I think, if they haven't got it already, I believe that they actually have been pretty recently approved for US approval for diagnostics with wearable EEG technology. Now, that's not neurofeedback, but I do consider it a little bit within the same niche. So the wheels are turning. And like I said, a couple of companies coming out of stealth mode with data, and we'll just have to wait and see. And then it differs within different countries as well. It's interesting. I talked to some people in Germany and German companies, and their businesses actually get reimbursed by the government to have their clients engage in health and wellness activities, and neurofeedback falls under that umbrella. So there's different regulatory concerns as well. I wish that they had that in the US, where companies were being insurance was actually paying for neurofeedback training. I think that's actually pretty rare here in the US, but in other countries, it's actually more common. So regulatory structures come into play sometimes as well.
I see. Now that's very interesting. And let's transition to from the communities to the individual. Do you have any thoughts on how one might pick their wearable? Let's say that I've never done anything. Maybe I know a little bit about psychology because I took psych in college or something like that. But maybe I'm just generally interested in neurotech, neurofeedback. can you give any recommendations, non-medical, of course, but any recommendations on how one might pick the neurofeedback or neurotech for them?
Yeah, sure. I wanted to back up a second. I said NeuroOptimal for that Betty DeVos company, but it was actually NeuroCore. It was a
Neurocore, I
big
see.
company that had brick and mortar neurofeedback clinics. So I didn't want to misspeak there and say the wrong thing.
I see. Thanks
So
for that.
going back to what I generally recommend for people, I do have that physician diagnostic framework in my mind from what I learned from medical school. So I do try
Yes,
to use that in recommendations for neurofeedback or wearable technologies. So, what's the issue? Are you having trouble sleeping? Are you having trouble with focus? Is it your mood? Would you like to enhance your meditation? And based on those issues that we're trying to address, that's where I start first, and then I'll recommend a device from there. Obviously, if you are really interested in meditation and you want more of an entry level device that's quite affordable, Muse Headband is a great one that has a lot of support framework around it. Their software and their meditation training resources on the app are excellent. If you are more into programming and you want actual access to the software development kit and you are going to use the device for some uh, pretty involved programming, that's when I lean more towards the Neurosity Crown, which has great infrastructure for support for people that want to design software around these devices. And then there's quite a few different devices in between.
I see. And for
And I
those of
could
you
go
that
into
aren't,
that
go
into
ahead.
more detail if you would like, but
Oh, yeah, I was
I
going to
could
say
talk
that
a
for those of
whole
you that want,
hour about that.
oh, yeah. So for those of you that want more detail, Dr. Rall has a pretty long video, actually a lot of videos on picking the headset. So I'll be sure to include a link to his YouTube channel in the show notes. If you look for his videos, I think he's got one where he reviews, I think over like maybe 20 or 25 minutes, a bunch of different headsets. So take a look at that. I'll include that in the notes if you want to learn more about how you can pick your own headset. So
Yeah,
the next,
every fall I try to release one of those review videos about what has happened during the year and what my recommendations for that year are. So I'll have another one coming out here in about the October timeframe that I'm starting to gear up for and prepare for.
I see. Well, I'm excited for that. So we were talking about people who might be interested in data. So we'll talk about uh, your recommendations on that in just a second. But one thing I am interested in, and I think you just did a video on this recently, one of the new forms of headsets, it's not new technology, but now it's more accessible, is a FNIRS. Am I saying that correctly? Or
Yeah,
FNIRS?
FNIRS, yeah.
Yeah. Now, do you have any opinions on that? Or do you think is it still too soon to tell whether that can be a replacement or a supplement to the EEGs?
I think it's going to be a supplement. I think
Mm,
that the more data that we have, the better we can determine what's happening with the brain. And to be quite honest, the data is so complex that I don't think that we're going to be able to get some inferences just by eyeballing it, but we're going to be heavily assisted by machine learning
mm.
is going to be a big part of this. And the more data that you have, the better that the AI is able to associate classifiers with that data and the subjective experience of the person. So if you're using EEG to track quicker reactions to things with ERPs and taking a look at various power densities of where the brain is at with the different EEG frequencies that are happening in any given situation, that's valuable data. And if you're using the FNIRS, and for those of you that are not familiar with FNIRS, really the baseline explanation of that is you are shining near infrared light through the skull that bounces off the blood that's surrounding the brain, and you can measure blood flow with that. That can be very valuable data in many different situations. The EEG is quicker for quick reactions to stimuli, but the blood flow can be very valuable in determining baseline levels of blood flow, how different areas of the brain are communicating to each other, which is becoming increasingly important in mental health disorder diagnostics. I mean, if you look at like the APA journal that comes out every month, it seems like all the most scientific studies are talking about functional MRI studies where they are looking at blood flow of the brain and talking about the connectome, how different areas of the brain are communicating to each other, how different areas of the brain tend to turn on with each other to represent different circuits. There's a salient circuit. There is the default mode network, which has become pretty famous in the niche over the years. So we're going to be using both. And some of the more exciting developments are coming out of the very high end, high investment companies. There's Kernel, which Brian Johnson is heading up. For those of you who don't know who Brian Johnson is, I would call him almost like kind of an Elon Musk type figure, where he did very similar to what Elon did, create a company that assisted digital financial transactions. Like Elon had he had a company that originally was bought by PayPal, and Brian had something similar, and then decided that he wanted to do something very impactful for humanity, and used his tens of millions to $100 million to found this company. Long story short, they have a headset that's very advanced right now that's using both EEG and FNIRS, but more heavily FNIRS. It's called Kernel Flow. And it really is sort of pushing the boundaries of what is capable in that technology. And they have been able to show that they can do connectome studies. I mean, they just published an exploratory study where Brian took ketamine, and they were able to look at his connectome before, during, and after the treatment. And it lines up exactly with what the research has been saying over the years. It's
wow.
You have your connectome, you take the ketamine, it quiets down the default mode network, which is instrumental in that self-referential rumination thought that can be very debilitating for people. You're thinking too much, overthinking things. That quiets down, and that's reflected over the weeks after the treatment. In my opinion, FNIRS is less liable to movement artifacts, which I think is actually very important in certain situations. We're looking at using it with race car drivers and their helmets. And the military is looking at it as well, particularly for fighter pilots. So they're looking at putting in technologies into the helmets that can predict when a fighter pilot is going to pass out. I don't know if you saw the new Top Gun movie, Maverick. I
Not yet.
loved that movie. It was really awesome and fun to see Tom Cruise doing what he does best.
Oh yeah.
But in that movie, a key part was they were doing a certain maneuver that put them very much at risk for passing out due to the high G forces. So if you think about that, blood flow of the brain definitely could predict how much oxygen is being delivered to the brain and how well someone's wakefulness is performing in that situation. So you theoretically could tell if someone's going to pass out and give them that data so that they can correct their maneuvers so that they don't pass out.
Yes.
There's a lot of different applications for that. And then I think on the more everyday level, I'm working pretty closely with a company, Mendy, that's based in Stockholm, Sweden. And they are using a type of FNIRS that measures the blood flow of the frontal lobe. And we think that we can really use that data to track how well someone is focusing at work or at school and in various other circumstances, and improve their ability to focus and maintain attention, which is very needed these days, especially with how fractured our attention span is with social media and other distractions, and people working from home with the pandemic and being exposed to more distractions. Theoretically, in my opinion, I think the office environment is very distracting. I've actually been working from home for the last couple of years and prefer it, but that doesn't mean that we don't have a ton of distractions around. So that is where I think FNIRS falls into the spectrum, is that both FNIRS and EEG are going to have great applications, and they might actually be better choices than the other, depending on the situation. The other thing that I'll mention is that FNIRS seems to have a little bit more of variability in technique. So there's actually like 3 different types of FNIRS right now. There's continuous FNIRS, where you use a continuous laser and measure the diffraction pattern. And I didn't explain this very well, but you can tell if blood is oxygenated or deoxygenated based on how the laser bounces off the blood. That's how you can determine blood flow, because oxygenated versus deoxygenated blood has different refractive properties to the red light. So you have to have very good sensors to determine that, but you can use a continuous laser to see how that's being affected. You can use time domain lasers, which is more quantitatively accurate, which is what the kernel headset is using, which has its own challenges because the sensors and the lasers have to be extremely accurate in how the light is shining and how the data is being assimilated. Actually causes a lot of heat, which is what I noticed when I had the kernel headset on my head, is that it generates a lot of heat. So they have to have cooling mechanisms within the helmet, and that makes the helmet a little bit heavier. So, troubleshooting those issues. And then if you look at what Mary Lou Jepsen is doing with open water, they're actually using near infrared right now to take a look at stroke victims. So they can determine whether it's a hemorrhagic versus an ischemic stroke in the ambulance using FNIRS, which is important because that determines whether or not someone gets a medication called HPA, which you would only give to someone that was having an ischemic stroke, like a blockage in their blood flow. But where they're taking that technology further is they're actually able to use ultrasound. So they use ultrasound pulses with the FNIRS to create fractal patterns that are reassimilated into an actual 3D image of what they are scanning.
That's awesome.
So instead of just functional information about the blood flow, they're actually seeing structural imaging. You can go on their website and see the structural imaging of animal rat models that they've done in their lab, and they plan on doing that with humans. So sort of going full circle, where I saw how they were using those big fancy $10 million MRI machines to see the actual myelin sheaths within people's brains that were damaged by IED blasts. I believe within the next 10 years, we are going to have a wearable that's able to take a look at that type of thing for a 10th, 100th, even 1,000th of the cost. And when you combine structural imaging in wearables with functional data like EEG and blood flow from FNIRS, you have some very powerful technologies that we can use to do brain-computer interface and fulfill a lot of the fantasies that people have about that technology that we're not there yet.
Yes. I'm very excited for the future. I think the future looks pretty bright. I think it's just a matter of time and data collection, like we've talked about. Now that transitions into one of my last questions, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. But a lot of the people that follow me, they're either neuroscience or they're psychology students, or they're interested in learning more about neuroscience or psychology. So what would you say for, let's say, the current neuro or psychology student? What would you recommend they do if they're interested in getting into things like neurotech or neurofeedback? Maybe what they study in school or what they maybe study on their own time if they want to get into the field?
Play to your strengths. If you think about brain-computer interface, it's an entire new burgeoning field that needs everything and anything. You need programmers to create the software. You need designers, visual designers to develop the games that we're going to be using. We need engineers to design the hardware. So play to your strengths, go the direction that excites you. If you want to do brain-computer interface, don't force yourself to do something that you're not that interested in, because it's so multifaceted that you can still be associated with the niche and with the industry no matter what you're doing. So that's what I would recommend is know yourself, know your strengths, and go in that direction. And the better you get at that skill, the more valuable you will be to that community. And we can all work together to create something really awesome in the coming years.
I see. Sounds very exciting. Well, you've answered all of my questions, so this is really awesome for me. To wrap up, do you have any other thoughts or questions or things you want to share for now?
No, there's a lot going on, and I'm really excited about the next couple of years. And I appreciate you having me on my on your podcast. It's not very often that I get to be on the other side of the camera. Our podcast. It's fun being on the other side of the camera and answering some questions. And I appreciate what you're doing. And anybody else that wants to create content about this, I am very open to doing this type of thing, because I think that the more the people that are involved and spread the word of what's going on, not only will there be more awareness in the community, but also we need funding, right? We need people that have resources, to include financial resources, to invest in the space and to further the technological developments and the data collection that needs to happen in order to do some awesome things with brain-computer interface technology in the next 10 to 20 years.
I see. Well, thank you for sharing that, and thank you for being on and sharing some of your knowledge, your background, and wisdom. This was awesome for me. I think a lot of people will find this super helpful. So I'll go ahead and wrap up and say thank you, Dr. Cody, and I look forward to your next video.
Thanks, Devin.
Yep, thank you. Okay, have a great day.
Yep.
All right, that's it. All right, so that's all I got for you.